Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. Welcome. Welcome to the third episode of the training series Visualizing Data with Impact, organized by the data.europa Academy together with Alberto Cairo. We are very excited to start this session, Data Narrative and Design, that it will be around 1 hour and a half of session plus questions and answers with Alberto Cairo. So please don't hesitate to write down your questions in the chat because he will address them all at the end of the session. In these 2 days, we were thrilled to see all this interaction in the chats and a lot of conversation and a lot of connection between the community, and wanted to continue this community ongoing. So in the European Data Portal, we have the collaboration channel, one forum where you can connect to one another and share best practices, and you have a specific channel where you can exchange with other peers. So I invite you to join this collaboration channel. All the materials are published on the data.europa Academy under the lesson Visualizing Data with Impact, with additional resources from Alberto Cairo. I'm not going to take more time from Alberto because we all very much look forward to hear what you want to say and to continue this training. But from my side, I would like to thank you, Alberto Cairo, so much for these wonderful 3 days of learning, also from my side, and we very much look forward to this last session. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, it has been a lot of fun so far, and I hope that it was also quite productive and educational for the people who attended the first 2 webinars. And I hope that this third one will also be informative, interesting, fun. We are going to actually talk about very fun things, such as the influence of art and creativity in visualization, but also about topics more related to analytics and the visual display of information, which is what we were covering in the past couple of webinars. So as Inma was saying, this is the third webinar of a series of 3. The materials are available online. All the sessions are being recorded. The slide decks that I'm using for the 3 webinars are being made available to you, so you will be able to download them, because if you attended the first 2 webinars, you know that the slides contain links to extra resources, readings, book recommendations. I have several books here that I have been recommending in the past couple of days, just because obviously in these 3 webinars, I don't have enough time to cover absolutely everything about visualization. It's just enough time to give you a taste of what visualization is about, how it works, how you can get started. And if you want to continue learning about visualization, you can use certainly the materials that I'm providing in the slide decks, the extra readings that I will refer to later, but also the books that I'm recommending these days. More about housekeeping before we jump right in. In the previous seminars, I provided an introduction to the language of visualization. We talked about the grammar of graphics at a certain length. I also explained how to try to avoid that our graphics end up being misread by people and what to do about that. We talked about accessibility. I will cover a little bit more of that today, accessibility. We talked about how to choose the most appropriate type of graphic for every situation. I also provided some resources for you to do that. And today we're going to talk a little bit more about structuring a layout and multi-section visualization, or building narratives or stories based on those graphics that we design. And I will also talk about visual design, typography, color composition, and finally I will share with you a few thoughts about things that are of my interest in recent times, and where visualization may be going in the next few years. Now you're going to see me. You noticed this yesterday. You will see my head moving side to side. That the reason for that is I'm using 3 different screens for this presentation. I have my presentation in 2 different computers, so don't get distracted by the fact that I'm moving my head constantly from one side to the next one. In any case, so in the past couple of webinars, if you remember, I introduced you to a structured way to think about visualization, to make informed choices, justified decisions whenever we design a graphic. I also pointed out that this structured manner of thinking about visualization is not the only way to think about visualization. It is just my way, the way that I have developed throughout nearly 3 decades, designing visualizations, art directing visualizations, doing consulting about visualization, and also teaching visualization both in the context of universities and also in the context of companies. Referring to my latest book, the fourth one in the series that I have been writing in the past decade, The Art of Insight, I also described what are the elements of these structured thinking about visualization that I believe that we need to consider. They're not the only ones, but probably they are the most important. So we discussed about the importance of thinking about the nature of the data that we are presenting in order to structure our visualization correctly, thinking about the audience, thinking about the purpose, what the visualization is for, what it is that we're trying to communicate, what type of tasks we want to enable the reader to be able to accomplish with our visualization, considering constraints, the size of the graphic, and so on and so forth. And I also made the point that, in my opinion, all decisions in visualization, contrary to some literature about visualization that I tend to disagree with, I think that all decisions in visualization are extremely subjective. But that doesn't mean that they should be arbitrary. Any decision in visualization, every single decision that we make when we design a graphic, from the baseline of the graphic to the scale of the graphic to the colors that we use to the typography to what we choose to show, what we don't choose to show, we need to have a conscious reason for that. We need to be able to verbalize why we are doing things in a particular way. And that's the spirit. That's the spirit that I have tried to share with you in the past couple of webinars. And we also discussed this little diagram here that we are using as a table of contents that describes the many elements that we need to consider when we think about how to design a data visualization. In yesterday's webinar, there was a very good question about why I structured this diagram in a linear fashion from the bottom up. And I pointed out that I did that because it works really well as an index, right, for the structure of this presentation. But I'm considering redesigning this diagram in a non-linear fashion, like in a network diagram, in which all these elements are connected to each other. Because when I teach data visualization, I teach all these topics from the bottom up, right? Like if it were a series of chapters, right, of a book. But when I actually design a visualization, I don't take these things into consideration one by one and one after the other. All of them are connected to each other and all of them feed into each other somehow. We have already covered the scaffolding. We have already covered encodings, marks, and channels. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about arrangements, right? How important it is to think and to make conscious, deliberate decisions about how we structure the elements within a single chart or within a single map. How much the very order of objects within a visualization can completely change our perceptions of a visualization. The reason why I point this out is that whenever we design visualizations, we tend to leave many decisions in the hands of the computer software, although computer software doesn't have hands, obviously, but that's a figure of speech, right? We tend to leave too many decisions to the software tool to make. And if you're getting anything from these webinars, is my idea that computers are dumb and software tools are dumb. It's a human being who needs to make informed choices using these software tools. Because if we just rely on what the computer software tool gives us, probably the decisions that software is going to make are completely wrong, or they are not the ones that should be made in that particular situation. So let me show you just an example. This is a real world example. This comes from I believe that this comes from people who participated in a workshop of mine years ago. They came from a market research agency and they designed this graphic. I'm going to describe this graphic to you. This graphic is a bar graph, as you can see. Each one of the bars corresponds to a percentage of people, right? Each one of these bars essentially could add up to 100% of people, right? So the higher the bars are, the higher the percentage of people over the total of people, right? Now, what this graphic is representing is essentially the efficacy, the self-reported efficacy of different media when delivering advertising. This is based on a survey that was conducted years ago with a representative sample of people of different ages, asking them, do you pay attention to advertising, to ads, to commercials that you see on TV, on newspapers, on magazines, in movie theaters, or that you listen to in the radio? So each one of these bars corresponds to the percentage of people within each one of those age groups that you have there at the bottom who say, yes, I do pay attention to this particular advertising. So very quickly, you can see that television advertising is the most effective, according to what people say about themselves, right? Yes, I do pay attention to advertising that I see on TV. So the designers of this graphic at the time in the workshop, we were having this discussion about this graphic, and whenever clients or collaborators ask me what I think about a graphic that they have designed, they usually pose the question as a right or wrong. Do you think that this graphic is right, or do you think that this graphic is wrong? Or do you think that this graphic is good, or do you think that this graphic is bad? And I hinted in yesterday's webinar, that the answer to that question is much harder than it seems, because I cannot assess the quality of graphic if I don't know what the intent of the graphic is, because as it is, this graphic is perfectly fine. It's beautifully designed, it's well organized. I even like the colors, I like the layout. The type of graphic chosen, right, to represent the data is an adequate one. It's a bar graph. So it's, as we mentioned yesterday, bar graphs are great for comparisons, right? So we can compare things to each other quite easily. But the question is, what do we really want to compare here, right? And that is the key thing, right? This is what happens. This graphic is the result of letting, I don't know, Excel or Tableau or R or Illustrator or whatever tool you use to make choices for you as to how to sort the data, how to organize the data. And it's not necessarily wrong. As you can see, these percentages are organized according to the age groups that each one of the bars corresponds to, right? But this arrangement of data works only if the intent of the graphic, if what we want people to see in the graphic, or what we want people to do, to be able to do with the graphic, is to see which media is more effective within each one of these age groups, right? So you can correctly compare them. Let's say that you are preparing a marketing campaign and you are going to focus the campaign on boomers or on millennials or whatever. You can focus your eyes just on those 5 bars, right, corresponding to millennials, and you can see, let's say, younger millennials, right, trailing millennials. This is a relatively old graphic. So obviously, if you focus your campaign on trailing millennials, you would invest a lot of money on television ads, because that's the highest bar in the group by far. And then the fourth one, that's movie theater ads. That's interesting, and we should invest some money on movie theater ads, right? So that this graphic is perfectly fine for that purpose, right? But I always love to put people in sort of like alternative scenarios. We did this yesterday, if you remember, when I showed you how we could encode the same data set as a pie chart, as a bar graph, or as a map. And each one of them will be perfectly fine of those types of graphics, depending on the situation that we were. The map is good for certain things, the pie chart is good for certain things, and the bar graph is good for certain things. And what I pointed out yesterday is that none of those graphics were right or wrong. They were just better or worse, or better suited or worse suited for particular tasks or for particular purposes. And I also pointed out that we shouldn't let the software tool make decisions for us. We shouldn't work on autopilot. Oh, we have countries in this data set. Let's design a map. No, wait a second. Think a little bit about what it is that you really want to show. Well, this is actually similar. What is it that we really want to show? Do we want to compare the advertising methods within each one of the groups? Then this is great, fantastic, great graphic. But what if? The what if is always important. Try to reverse engineer the graphics that we see every day. What if the purpose was different? What if the purpose that we have in mind is not to be able to focus our attention on one age group, but what we want to do is to see the generation after generation change in self-reported efficacy of these advertising methods, meaning across the generations, which advertising methods increase or decrease in terms of self-reporting efficacy. Doing that is quite easy to do with television ads, right? You can see the television goes down a little bit, goes up a little bit, and then goes down, right? Older people tend to pay less attention to television ads, as you can see. But you can see that trend on television ads, self-reported efficacy, simply because the bar corresponding to TV is the first one in the group, and it's also the highest. Try to see the same thing with, let's say, movie theater ads, the green bar, in theater ads. You will quickly find yourself squinting like I'm doing right now, and with your finger doing these. Okay, here, 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 here. It goes down. If you remember previous webinars, I call this the finger measurement test. When you find yourself doing this, it's probably because there is something in the graphic that could be further improved. And in that case, right, what could be improved here could be the sorting of the bars. If, always, if the purpose of the bars, here, the bar graph, is not to compare within each one of the age groups, but to compare across the age groups, then we need to arrange the elements of the chart in a way that facilitates that task. For example, instead of grouping the bars by generations, we could group the bars by media, right? Or sorting the bars in different ways to sort by media, right? So each one of the groups of the bars right now are television, newspaper, magazine ads, and theater ads. And then each one of the columns corresponds to a generation. So now you can see television going down, newspapers going up, magazines going up and then down and then up again, movie theater ads going down very sharply, and radio ads going up and then going down. These patterns that this graphic reveals can be revealed here, but you need to use your finger in order to see them. Simply by sorting the bars in a completely different way, we are enabling something completely different. But I would like to circle back to something that I have just said. None of these graphics is good or bad, wrong or right in the abstract or at an abstract level. They are just better or worse depending on what the answer to that question is. And that's a question that you need to pose yourself. On webinar 1, if you remember, we talked about learning objectives, right? Well, that's a question that essentially matches the learning objective structure. I want my reader to compare within age groups, or I want my reader to compare across age groups. That's the conscious decision. That's the deliberate decision. It's a very subjective decision, but it is not an arbitrary decision. Now, you may be wondering why I didn't use color here. In the original graphic, color was used as a visual channel, as an identifier, right? So you could quickly identify the different media. But here I didn't use colors, I used numbers. And the reason why I use numbers instead of different colors is that there's a natural sequence, right? This is an order, a variable from younger to older. So I decided, well, once people understand that the first bar corresponds to very young people and the last one corresponds to very old people, we don't need colors anymore, like we did in the categorical variable that we had before. This variable is still categorical, but it's an order variable. I would be fine with using different shades of color to indicate that, perhaps a little bit better, maybe slightly lighter for young people, slightly darker for older people, just to reinforce that sequential nature of the generation variable. But if I can get away without adding more elements to my charts, I usually try to do that. I tend not to overemphasize things too much. That's just my style. I try to keep things simple, but I wouldn't be opposed to that. If you tell me as a designer, oh, I would prefer to emphasize that a little bit more by adding shades of color here just to further emphasize the message, go with it. That's a great decision. See how subjective this is? We can have a conversation about it and we can reach a consensus. That consensus will be very subjective, but it's not arbitrary because you are giving me a reason. I prefer to add color because that is going to emphasize the fact that this is an order list of generations. I will accept that reason over mine. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about annotations. I already hinted a lot of things that I'm saying in this third webinar, in previous webinars, how important annotations are. I pointed this out yesterday, if you remember, when we were discussing the cone of uncertainty, displaying where hurricanes may go in the next few days, I pointed out that I always wish that we could add a textual explanation to that graphic so people can actually see what it is that they are looking at. I am a huge fan of annotations in graphics. Whenever I see a chart in a newspaper, whatever it is, or in magazines, online, etc., I always wish that chart contains some sort of like good title, good intro, a couple of annotations that point out what I want, what I need to focus on. We call that in visualization the annotation layer. And the annotation layer is quite important for different reasons, in my opinion, in communication graphics, not so much in exploratory graphics, right? If you want to do an interactive dashboards for experts to explore a particular data set, you don't necessarily need a very complex or rich annotation layer. You can just simply put the data in there, add a title, buttons and menus so people can navigate the data. That's it. But when it comes to communicating a specific message with your graphics, adding annotations that point out, hey, take a look at this. This is important. Or this line is growing here because such and such. Or this bar graph is lower because such and such. Those types of annotations that we could add to any graphic serve the function of emphasizing things that are important in a graphic, and may also serve as an entry point to a particular graphic. While navigating several graphics by the European Union and Eurostat while preparing for this webinar, I discovered these great examples of annotations. So this is antimicrobial resistance. I'm going to show it to you, the website here. This is about microbial resistance. You can see that all these graphics contain little annotations that put the data in context. Actually, I cannot increase the size of these for some reason, okay? Notice that you see a decrease here, and whoever designed this graphic, very wisely, in my opinion, added this explanation. This decrease could be explained by changes in blah, blah, blah. That adds not only flavor to the graphic and interest to the graphic, it also answers a possible question that people may have about the data. It's not always possible to explain ups and downs in a chart like this, but if we see something that that moves out of the norm, right, an outlier of the data, a sudden drop in a data set, and we can explain it, why not explain it? Or why not adding a footnote to it? Now, annotations also serve another purpose, and this is more related to accessibility. Notice something else that these graphics do, in my opinion, extremely well. They contain a text version. This is one of the main recommendations in accessibility research, because many people are visually impaired. They will not be able to see your graphic, but if you add a textual description, alternative text, alt text, to your graphics, this text can be computer read to the person who's trying to see your graphic, and they will be able to envision that graphic in their minds. There are many people out there, and later I will refer to them, who are experimenting with different accessibility features in visualizations. One of them is alternative text. Another one is adding a sonification feature to the graphic. So because visualization is just one of the many ways in which we could represent data, we can also represent data through sounds, right? A graphic like this will sound bum, 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 right? Going up, going down. That's sonification of the data. Later in the presentation, I will give you a couple of resources to read more about these types of data sensification, which go beyond mere data visualization. Talking about accessibility, by the way, there were a couple of questions about this in previous webinars. So I decided to include a couple of links to resources that I would like you to bookmark. In my opinion, this is one of the best resources about visualization accessibility. This is a project created by my friend Frank Elavsky, who is an expert in visualization. And also an expert in accessibility in visualization. He's currently completing his PhD in visualization accessibility. And years ago, he co-created this website called Chartability, which essentially is a great resource. It's like a checklist of things that we all need to pay attention to whenever we design a visualization. Increase contrast, decrease font sizes, add alternative text, blah, 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 those types of recommendations and many more. you can find in this website. So it's an extraordinary resource if you want to increase the accessibility of your graphics. I have been increasingly interested in visualization accessibility just because I want to essentially democratize all this stuff. Right? I want more and more people to be able to access all these things, right? So we should all care about these. Let me show you an example, by the way, and this is a great segue for me to talk about data narrative, how I structure data stories. But before I talk about that particular example in terms of using it to illustrate the way that I create stories, let me talk about it in terms of accessibility. So this is a graphic that I usually use. It's in one of my books, and I usually use in talks to talk about how I build stories based on data, how I structure them, right? But I also started using it to talk about accessibility. Because if you take a look at this graphic, right, and you see that the main color palette, the main colors in the color palette are red and green. Well, one of the main advice, one of the main pieces of advice that people in accessibility in data visualization will give you is be very careful with red and green color palettes. Always test your graphics for color blindness. If you have the most common type of color blindness, which is red and green color blindness, reading that map up there will be impossible to you. Now, how do I know? Well, there are many resources today that we can use. So I'm going to give you another recommendation. There is a free tool that I have installed in my computer. This is free, open source, and safe. Okay, it's called Color Oracle, like the Oracle of Delphi. Color Oracle, right? You can find this online very easily. You just Google Color Oracle. This is a tool that you can install in your computers, and when you turn it on, it will change the appearance of your screen to simulate what your screen will look like to people who have different types of color blindness, from the most common one to the least common one, right? So what does this graphic look like to a person with the most common type of color blindness? That's what it looks like. Not great, right? Not fantastic. So that gives us a great reason to look for a different color palette. Rather than red and green, it could be, for example, I don't know, blue and green. I don't know, or orange and green, or we can alter the shades of those colors. So even if people cannot see the hues, maybe they will be able to see the shades of those hues. So testing our graphics for color blindness is one of the most important pieces of advice that people in accessibility in data visualization will give us. Today, I know better. I designed that graphic. I co-designed that graphic more than a decade ago. And if I had to redesign it today, I will change the color palette to take accessibility into account. This is the website, by the way, colororacle.org. And there are many other resources out there that also let you simulate color blindness. Color Oracle is just one of them. In any case, as I was saying, this graphic here is something that I usually use to talk a little bit about how I usually build narratives in data visualization, because that graphic is a narrative. That's a graphic that I co-designed years ago when I was working in Brazil. It was published in 2010 or 11 or something like that. And it talks about population variation patterns in Brazil. This was published after the Brazilian Census Bureau released their latest data in 2010. And what the latest data at the time showed, that's the first half of this poster. This is like a big poster, a big data poster that was published in a magazine. In one of the magazines that I used to work for, Epoca magazine, a weekly news magazine. The first half of the poster shows that between 2000 and 2010, Brazil's population grew in general. It went from 170 million people up to 191 people. And the first half of the graphic, the first portion of the poster, shows us population variation at the national level, that's the first column, at the state level, that's the second column, the table and the bar graph over there, and then at the local level, a province, also not province, but a municipality by municipality. Okay? In most places in Brazil grew in terms of population, but you can see that some of them also lost population, particularly in the southern part of the country. In any case, this is not really a story. It's not a narrative. It's just a data display, right? This is population growth in Brazil. That's it. It's as good as it gets. We could transform it into an interactive graphic, right? We didn't do this at the time, right? But we could have done it, letting people search for their own town, or letting people hover over each one of the subdivisions on the map, and so on and so forth. But it's a print graphic. Now, the story part, the narrative part, is what comes after that. Because when we were working on this project, we collaborated with political scientists and demographers to try to come up with a compelling narrative, right? So asking ourselves, how do we show people, a general reader, why they should care, right? Well, this is interesting enough, right? Brazil's population grew, but do we care that much about that? Why should we care, right? What are the underlying patterns in changes in terms of population that Brazil had been experimenting for a decade or more in the past? And in collaboration with these experts, we decided that a good focus for these will be to talk a little bit about fertility rates, asking ourselves, is Brazil's population going to keep growing in the future, right? Well, they probably not. And the reason for that is that fewer and fewer children are being born in Brazil. This is a common phenomenon everywhere, as you know, in the world. You probably, many of you are European, like I am. Fertility rates, birth rates in all Europe are relatively low. But then if we go to countries that are developing, right? If we go, for example, to Middle Eastern countries or Sub-Saharan African countries, etc., fertility rates tend to be much higher, right? Women in general, on average, there are countries in which the fertility rate is 4 children per woman, 5 children per woman, is relatively high. And in countries like Spain, for example, or France, fertility rates tend to be much lower, 1.2, 1.3 children per woman, and so on and so forth. Well, I remember that at the time when we were designing this poster, I did an informal survey among friends and colleagues in Brazil, asking them, what do you think that the current fertility rate, number of children per woman, right, in the country, what do you think that the current fertility rate of Brazil is? Just ask yourself that question, right? But we have this idea of Brazil as a developing nation, right? So answers to that question, to my question, range from a 2 point something, 3 point something, from 2.2.3 up to 3.5. That was the range, more or less, of the answers that I got to this informal, non-representative, non-scientific survey that I conducted among friends. And those guesses were completely off, because Brazil, in the past 50 years, has experienced one of the sharpest drops in fertility rates in the world. It came down from 6 children per woman in the 1950s down to, at the time, I believe, in 2010, it was 1.9. Children per woman. Other countries also went down. India and many other countries also came down. But Brazil's drop was much sharper. Now, before I continue, by the way, this is not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because there are very positive human developments behind this drop of fertility rates. Throughout the years, Brazil has become a more equal country in terms of gender, right? Women are accessing education and the workforce more and more. And as a consequence of that, naturally, they sort of like people have more freedom to choose to have or not to have children, right? Birth control methods are also more widespread than they used to be in the distant past. So there's a positive story to tell, in my opinion, about these developments. Now, the not so positive part of the story, though, is that, or let's say not extremely positive, is that Brazil, like most countries in Europe, has a relatively good safety net, right? In Brazil, you have access to public health care, you have access to public education, and obviously, if you want to maintain a healthy safety net, which I believe is a very positive thing to have. I live in the United States, where the safety net is almost non-existent, and that causes all types of problems, so I feel strongly about it. But if you want to maintain a healthy safety net, you need people who can pay taxes, right? People who are working pay taxes in order to maintain the safety net going, right? And Brazil is predicted, like many other countries, is predicted to face a challenge with these. Because the population of Brazil, if you take a look at the graphic on the upper right-hand side, population of Brazil was predicted at the time to keep growing up to 2030 or more like that, so a few years from now. And after that, it is predicted to start dropping after that. And more importantly, when we compare the current, at the time, the current population pyramid of Brazil, it looked at like a triangle, right? Meaning many young people at the bottom, very few old, elderly people on top, to the one that was predicted for 2050. That one looks more like a square. Fewer younger people at the bottom, many more elderly people, many more people retiring on top. Again, none of this is negative per se, but if you want to maintain your safety net, which I believe is something that we should try to do, maybe the country, overall society, needs to prepare for that, right? Maybe we need to increase taxes, or maybe we need to give families incentives. I don't know. I'm not a politician. I'm not a social scientist, right? But the fact is that there is a challenge here. Now, notice what I have just done. I haven't even talked about the data at all. I have not described, other than the 1.9 fertility rate of Brazil, which, by the way, is below the replacement rate, and that explains the predicted drop in population and the aging of the population. Other than that number, I have not described the data. And why is that? Because whenever I create a visualization like this, right, after I have understood the data, usually, as I mentioned yesterday, almost always in collaboration with experts, because I'm not a statistician, I'm not a data scientist, I'm not a demographer, I'm not a political scientist, usually in collaboration with people. What I try to do after I interrogate my collaborators, talk to them, discuss the numbers with them, etc., I try to walk away from the data a little bit and think about the big picture, right? Not only about what the numbers are, but about what the numbers mean or may mean. I mentioned this yesterday. I care a lot about what the numbers may mean, right? And what are the exceptions? What are the caveats? What are the uncertainties? And so on and so forth. And by walking away from the numbers a little bit, never forgetting them, obviously, but by walking away from the granularity, from the details, and focusing more on the big picture of the data, I am able to create a structure that may help me walk the reader through understanding the message that we want to convey. So after I do this process, what I do is to try to summarize my own thoughts in a structured manner through a very long sentence, right? In this case, it could be something like, sure, yeah, according to the latest data from the Census Bureau in Brazil, Brazil's population grew by this margin, blah, blah, blah. However, that's the but at the bottom. However, fertility rates are way below what demographers were expecting. So one of the consequences is that the population is predicted to drop. And I'm running out of breath here. And it's a very long sentence. I'm writing a very long sentence, essentially summarizing everything, right? Summarizing everything. And then what I do is to take that very long sentence and I split it up into its components. Brazil's population grew bigger, fertility rate is below expected. This is one consequence. This is another consequence. This is what we could do, maybe. This is the conclusion, if there is any conclusion. I split up the original sentence up into its components, and I sometimes transform the pieces of the original sentence into the titles of every section. The titles that I tend to write for my own graphics are not merely descriptive. If you read the titles of this graphic, they are not Brazil's population growth, Brazil's fertility rate, Brazil's aging population. They are not like that. They are declarative titles. They are explanatory titles, narrative titles. They actually give you a hint of what the graphic is showing. Brazil's population grew bigger, but fertility rate, hey, it is below expected, and so on and so forth. Like 99% of the things that I'm telling you in these 3 webinars, this is not a particularly original approach to narrative in visualization. I shamelessly stole this from a friend of mine. His name is Juan Velasco. Juan, also from Spain, used to be the graphics director at National Geographic magazine for many, many years. And I actually stole it from Juan and also from another friend of mine, Javier Sarracina, who is currently the graphics director at the Washington Post. There are many Spaniards doing infographics and data visualizations all over the world. So both from Javier and Juan, I borrowed this technique. They presented it in one talk and something clicked in my mind. I said, oh, I have been doing these myself, but I wasn't able to verbalize it. I was not able to explain clearly to myself that I was actually doing these. Now, not every graphic and not every data presentation can be structured this way. In this way, we could do it because there was clearly a very linear narrative that we could build. But as you know, because many of you work with data every single day, sometimes the stories that we can tell with data are not that clear, right? So sometimes the paths are not linear. The paths fork into several possible paths, right? So there are different ways in which we can structure a story. But the point that I'm trying to make is that that structure is essential. At some point, regardless of whether the path of the story is linear, regardless of whether it looks like a tree, these happen, and the explanation could be these, or that, the different possible explanations for a phenomena. That will be a nonlinear story. Regardless of what structure your story ends up adopting, the fact is that it is always useful to move away from the data, take a look at the big picture, and think about the structure at the same time that you're thinking about the details. Don't get lost into the details. Don't get lost into the, let's say, trees and forests, right? Don't get lost into the trees. Don't get lost into the overall forest. Both of them are important, the big picture and the details of the data that you are presenting to people. And then visual design. I'm going to give you just a few very specific recommendations about improving the visual design of your graphics. I'm not going to get into a very detailed discussion about typography, color, composition, etc., just because that will take us a very long time. This usually occupies several classes in my regular courses at the University of Miami, but at least I'm going to give you several specific tips that you can apply right away to your own designs and to your own visualizations. And then if this whets your appetite to learn a little bit more, then you can refer to the extra readings that I'm providing to you. Now, let me talk to you about what I consider, and this is something that my students hate me for because I keep hammering this over and over and over and over again when I give them feedback about their own projects, the importance of consistency and hierarchy. Okay? Right, so take a look at this design. This is another poster that I also co-designed with a couple of former colleagues of mine when I was working in Brazil. It's a big poster talking about giant telescopes all over the world, how they work, what they look like, and so on and so forth, right? The topic is besides the point. Now, I don't know whether you noticed that, but visually speaking, this project looks very visually consistent, right? Very visually consistent. Everything looks like it belongs together, right? All the elements look that they belong together. And that is because there are a lot of deliberate decisions made in this poster related to consistency, variety, and hierarchy. Those three elements are key rules or key principles in visual design, not necessarily just in visualization design, but in graphic design in general. I like to verbalize my own personal principles of design in a way that is memorable. So I usually tell the students the following. Keep these always in mind. Objects that are the same should look the same. Objects that are different should look different, right? Very simple principle. Now, how is that principle applied here? Let me zoom in here. Things that are the same should look alike. Take a look at these illustrations, right? All these illustrations is a sequence of illustrations that explains how the light navigates through a telescope. Notice that they all look the same, exactly the same. Same style, same outline style, same color, same absolutely everything. Numbers, they look all the same. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Why? Because they are objects that are the same. Things that are the same should look alike. However, things that are different should look different, right? Imagine this text box with the one looking exactly the same like body copy. It will look completely flat, right? And it will be breaking this very personal principle of visual design that is related to variety, right? By keeping attention on these, objects that are the same should look the same, we are maintaining consistency in our design. And by paying attention to this other principle, we are paying attention to the variety. Both things are important. And in the interplay between consistency and variety, we are creating a visual hierarchy. The number is more important than the text. This object that has a very, very bright color is more important than the objects that we have over here. That's the reason why these are grayed out, and so on and so forth. Now, things that are the same look alike, but then take a look at the other illustrations. This illustration looks very different to these illustrations, and these illustrations look very different to these illustrations, and this illustration looks very different to these illustrations, because each one of them is different to the others. But then they are self-consistent. All those illustrations, for example, the ones that you have there at the bottom, they look exactly the same to each other, okay? So this principle is essential in visual design. Objects that are the same should look the same. Objects that should look different should look different in terms of color, in terms of size. There are many ways in which you can vary the appearance of objects, but objects that are the same should be kept as consistent as possible. And another thing that can greatly improve your designs is to try to be extremely strict with alignment. This is something that I explain, I believe, in my first book, in the functional art, that whenever I envision a composition such as this one, what my brain is actually doing is drawing a bunch of rectangles. And you can see the rectangles here. Just by the sheer fact that objects are perfectly aligned with each other, your brain almost envisions the rectangles that I envision when I was designing this poster. And these rectangles, which I don't draw physically, right? I don't draw them physically, but I envision them, help me keep the space, maintain the space completely organized, right? And also, I try to be extremely strict, lining things up, even within a section. So all these illustrations have exactly the same width. All these text boxes are perfectly aligned here. All these photographs are perfectly aligned with each other, right? All these illustrations down here, as you can see, they have the same height and they are perfectly aligned with each other. And these text boxes are perfectly aligned with each other. But there's an exception here. Notice here. These illustrations are aligned with each other, but then these illustrations are not aligned with each other. Why? Why is that? You may be wondering. That breaks my own rule of keeping things aligned with each other. But if you think about it thematically, try to think about what would happen if the little icons at the bottom on the left-hand side were aligned with the icons on the right-hand side. If we align them all together, indirectly, or actually quite directly, that will signal to the reader that there is some sort of continuity between the first section on the left and the second section on the right, when in reality, those are two completely separate sections. And that's the reason why I shifted the order of the, sort of like the sorting order of the objects. I put some illustrations at the bottom and other illustrations a little bit above, breaking the continuity that didn't need to be there. So alignment is extremely important. This is also related to consistency in design. Now, you may be wondering, this looks great, this sounds great, but how do we apply these to, the real world? Well, just think about it. Whenever you create, for example, a graphic or a poster or a PowerPoint presentation in which you include a lot of icons, right? Icons are usually something very common in PowerPoint presentations. Probably many of you get icons from different libraries, right? Public libraries or libraries of icons that you have purchased. And sometimes we feel compelled to get an icon from one library, get an icon from another library, get another from another library. And the result of that, when we put them all together, is a mess of inconsistency, because we have one icon with one style, another icon with another style, another icon with another style. And that breaks the visual consistency of the design. Get all icons from the same library. Or if you are skilled enough with a graphic design tool, change the style of the icons so they all look the same. And when it comes to setting up text, pay attention to this principle. Objects are the same. Text that is the same should look alike. Text that is different should look different. Let's take a look at a real world example of the application of that principle to a real world visualization. Take a look at this graphic. The topic is completely besides the point, right? You can see that it's a stacked bar graph in which everything adds up to 100%. By the way, on webinar 2, I believe there was a question about three-dimensional graphics, and you can see that this graphic has a 3D effect. Yesterday, I said, well, in general, I try to avoid 3D graphics because they can make people's lives a little bit harder than they should, right? And this is a good example of that. How big is this red bar? Is this red bar 82%? Or should I mentally project the boundary of this red bar to the background? Because you can see that there's some separation between the bars and the grid lines. And this is 85 or 90, right? It makes it harder for me to estimate the relative sizes of these bar graphs. So I usually discourage people from using three-dimensional effects in static visualizations. Animated visualizations, that's a different story. But static visualizations, usually I try to avoid 3D. But that is not what I wanted you to pay attention to. Pay attention to the legend over here. Now, there's nothing wrong with the legend. The legend is perfectly readable. This is about fish catches, right? No catch declarations, paper catch declarations, right? It's perfectly fine. It is readable. But I don't know whether this happens to you, but there is something that makes me feel uneasy about this legend. It looks chaotic, right? We have the legend, and then we have a line break, and this element here is cut off with the second part of this going down to the next line, and then the 10 over here, and then the 12 over here. There's some chaos over here built in the design of these legend, right? And the reason for that is that it's not really designed. This is what happens when you let a dumb software tool. Nothing against Excel. I could say the same thing about any other type of data visualization tool. Data visualization tools, any type of software tool, they are dumb. They don't have the same contextual knowledge about what needs to be presented and how, right? They don't know where to put the line break. So they put the line break as soon as you reach the boundary of the text box, and then you jump to the next line. This is what happens when you let the software tool make decisions for you. But let's apply some reasoning to these. This is the way that I will think about this legend myself, in order to make it clearer, more beautiful, more elegant, and more readable. Each one of these legend items has two components: the legend itself, and then some sort of clarification in between parentheses. Legend clarification, legend clarification, legend clarification. We also have orphan words, right? This is called an orphan. An orphan is essentially a word that gets isolated at the end of a paragraph, and they make your text look unstable, right? It seems that it's about to fall. We're going to solve that in just 1 minute, simply by applying this rule. Objects that are the same should look at the same. Objects that look different should look different. Well, if we pay attention to these is the same as that, is the same as these, is the same as these, and the same as these. These is the same as these, and these, as these. So these, and these should look alike. These, and these should look alike. But this and that shouldn't look alike, because they are two completely different things. Objects that are different should look different, right? So this is the legend, this is the clarification, two different things. And one of them is more important than the other, right? Isn't it? So that will lead us to the principle of hierarchy. One of them needs to be further emphasized. So how much better this legend looks if we apply just 10 seconds of thinking about these, and we transform that legend to something like that. We move the clarification always to the second line, and we use bold style for the legend and light style or regular style for the clarification. Just by doing that, we have made the original legend was readable, but this is also readable, and it's a little bit clearer to the eyes of the reader. This is an example of something that I really emphasize to my students. In design, remember that yesterday and the day before, I made a lot of analogies between design and writing. Writing is easy. I can write a book in 4 or 5 months, but the first draft of the book is going to be absolutely terrible. Then I need to spend another 8 months editing the book in order to make it readable. Design is very similar. This is a very nice first draft of what the software tool does for us. It's perfectly readable, but just applying some editing to it, some manual, conscious, deliberate editing to the graphic, we are making the graphic more attractive, and there is something more attractive and more readable, not only more beautiful, but also more elegant and more readable. And what we are doing with that is to actually signal to the reader, and this is very important to me. We are actually signaling to the reader, I care about you. I care about the experience that you are having by reading my graphic. Software tools cannot do this thinking for us. Software tools don't care about people. They don't care about us. But we people, designers, data scientists, data analysts, statisticians, we do care about the reader who are going to read our graphics. And therefore, we need to work for them. We need to design our graphics in a way that look better to them, that make their experience of reading the graphic more pleasant, easier, and also more pleasant. Another example, this comes from Eurostat. Nothing wrong with the graphic. Graphic is very readable, beautifully designed. It belongs to a series of graphics. But take a look at the text at the bottom. I don't know whether that happens to you, but I encounter this all the time in data visualizations as a reader. I take a look at that graphic, and I would ask you to pay attention to the screen, to my camera, because I'm going to do something. Take a look at my face. When I see that text, you know what my head does? I have to do this in order to read that text. That's very uncomfortable, right? I'm getting older. My neck is already hurting. I want to straighten up my neck, right? Why tilting the text, right? In general, as a general rule, sometimes we cannot avoid it, but as a general rule, do avoid tilted text, period. That's also a principle of accessibility because it makes people's lives harder. Text that is tilted, 60 or 70 degrees or even 90 degrees in some cases. That is even worse, right? Now, sometimes we cannot avoid it just because we have so many labels at the bottom of our graphic, right? But in a line chart, for example, you will label every single data point, every single period of time. All right, we may need to tilt those labels, but what will be a good solution for that? Don't show the label for every single time point. Show me 1 out of 5 or something like that. Leave the tick marks for all of them, but label 1 out of 5. I can count. And then you can write the text horizontally. And then in a case like this, there's a very easy solution, in my opinion. This is all in my opinion, okay? Remember, this is all very subjective. It's just the opinion of someone who has been working in this industry for very long and also a constant reader of graphics, right? If I find myself doing these, notice what I did with my head, straightening it up again. Let's straighten up the graphic. Why don't we rotate the graphic instead of rotating the text? Just by doing that, now my experience of reading the graphic is much better. I can read the label, I can see the bar, I can compare the bars to each other. It makes the experience of reading the graphic on my part much more pleasant. And if you do that for me, you, the designer, the reader, I will thank you. Thank you for caring about me. Thank you for caring about the experience that I'm having by reading your graphic. Now, I could go on and on. I have tons of examples of makeovers that I could share with you, but we have very limited time, right? So I'm going to show you just one of my favorite examples. This one actually appears in my latest book, The Art of Insight. This is a poster, a scientific poster designed by students from the University of Miami who attended one of my workshops years ago. The title was something like Visual Design for Scientists or something like that. So I taught them visual design principles, very applicable, very practical visual design principles to the design of their posters. And as I do with every client, as I do with every collaborator, I kindly ask them, can you send me examples of your graphics? Because I am very constructive. I will criticize your graphic, but I will do it very kindly, very constructively. And I would actually take the work to actually redesign your graphic and show you the before and the after, how I would do it. And then feel free to adopt any of these recommendations, right? I don't mind. If you decide that my recommendations don't make any sense, just forget about them. Now, my experience of reading this poster, this is a poster about malaria, right, in South America. This is a fantastic research project from years ago from students, epidemiology project of malaria incidents in the Amazon region. Perfectly fine poster. It's readable, right? I can read it. I can see the different sections. But I see many things here that, as a reader, make me feel uneasy. The first one is that if I take a look at this as a reader, I say, there's so much stuff here. Where do I even begin? It looks so busy, right? Now, your first impulse as a designer, if you witness a reader doing that, this is so much. Your first impulse will be to remove content. Oh, there's too much content here. Let's remove content. Let's simplify things. If you remember the webinar yesterday, I said, according to my friend Nigel Holmes, I will talk to him in just a minute, who is also a visualization designer. Visualization design is not about simplification. It's about clarification. That means, can we maintain the same amount of content, but making it a little bit clearer or more pleasant to the eyes? And I believe that the answer is yes. We're going to get to that in just 1 minute. But the fact is that it looks very text heavy, right? Very text heavy. Then I made a few jokes with these students when I was teaching the workshop. This is actually something that I tell my students every semester. As a reader, I deeply dislike being able to tell what software tool was used to design something, because that signals, even if that is not your intention, right? That signals that you are leaving decisions in the hands of the software tool rather than making decisions yourself. Software tools don't care about us. And take a look at the diagram there in the middle, that inverted triangle that we have there in the middle, decision science, epidemiology, malaria. I guess that you can tell me what software tool was used to design that. That was probably an older version of PowerPoint. And there's nothing wrong with PowerPoint, right? But the default options of PowerPoint when it comes to design are not fantastic. That is also true of every software tool that I know of, by the way. So what can we do about that diagram? Actually, I could zoom into the diagram, right? Now, when you take a look at this diagram, what is the first thing that you see? The text or the bubbles? Probably the bubbles, right? The bubbles stand out more than the text. So I could point out as a reader and as a designer, that's a contradiction in terms, because what really matters here is the text, not the container, the content, not the container. So this is the opposite hierarchy that we should have. The text should be highlighted and the container should be downplayed or even removed completely. That's deliberate thinking. What matters the most? How can I create a hierarchy that emphasizes what matters and de-emphasizes what is secondary? Now take a look at this map, right? I couldn't change this map because I didn't have access to the underlying data. But if I run it through a color oracle, you can see that it's completely unreadable for colorblind people. This is an example of what we call in visualization the rainbow color palette, which is very common in the life sciences and physical sciences. My main advice to you is don't use it. It's a terrible color palette for maps and for graphics, mainly because this is a categorical color palette in this case that is used to represent a quantitative variable. And if you remember a continuous variable, if you remember the discussion yesterday about visual channels, I pointed out the principle of effectiveness and also I can go back to that slide over there if you don't remember what I'm talking about, right? So it's over here. The discussion that we had, let me see if I can find it very quickly over here, down here, right? The principle of expressiveness and the principle of effectiveness. Expressiveness is essentially what the graphic expresses, right? What is the graphic expressing? So if we are doing a graphic that contains a quantitative variable, a continuous variable, it is a contradiction in terms to express that data as a categorical color palette, right? It's a contradiction in terms. And not only that, it also makes it hard it makes people see artificial boundaries in the data, in the transition between the green and the orange. For example, it seems that this is important for some reason when it is not. It's just another data point on the scale. So it's a really, really bad color palette. What would be a good color palette here? Well, if the data is continuous, maybe a continuous color palette from lighter to darker, for example. Or we could use what we call in visualization and also cartography, a diverging color palette. I covered diverging color palettes, by the way, if I go back to the slides from yesterday. If you remember, one of the last points that I made was that in the readings, you have access to the chapter 10 of my second book, The Truthful Art, which is all about cartography. And in that chapter, I cover diverging color palettes. Diverging color palettes are essentially color palettes that use two different hues and then the shades of those two hues. For example, here, we could say, well, let's suppose that 117 is the median value in the district. It is not, but let's suppose that it is, right? We could use one color for below the median and another one for above the median, right? And then we play with the different shades of those two colors, below the median, above the median. That would be a diverging color palette. So I couldn't change these, but I did change these. I actually challenged the students saying, why do we have so many tick marks, so many subdivisions on this scale? Do these numbers mean anything? Are they meaningful for some reason? Are they, important thresholds or targets in the numbers? And no, they are just the numbers that were chosen by the software tool, right? The intervals that were chosen, I believe, by Python. This is the Python programming language. And say, well, the decisions as to how many numbers to include on the scale, what numbers to include on the scale, that should also be deliberate, right? Let's think about it together, right? This is, again, very subjective, but I can give you an example. We could just include the minimum number, the maximum number, the median number, whatever it is, and then the quartiles or something like that. Or if you prefer to use the average, you can use the standard deviation, minimum value, average, and then the standard deviations. And that's it, right? Those are the only numbers that you need on a map like this, because the purpose of a map like this is not precision, it's not effectiveness in the visualization sense of the word effectiveness. It's more the big picture, right? Higher values, lower values, and that's it. And then my favorite part of the graphic to make fun of, by the way, I need to make an aside. When doing critiques of people's work, I make fun of the graphics, not of the people, because I see myself in all these things that I pointed out. These are all things that I have made myself, mistakes that I have made myself in the past. So I know where they come from, right? All these bad decisions, in my opinion, bad decisions in terms of design. And I also try to be constructive and fun and kind whenever. So I take a look at this bar graph over here. And I joke with the students, why is this bar graph so gigantic? Is it important? For some reason, we want to highlight it, and therefore there needs to be gigantic there? No, it's a relatively secondary piece of content. The diagram in the middle is much more important. The bar graph is relatively secondary. So why is it so big? Well, it is big, probably, I said, because you were designing your poster, putting all the pieces there like in a puzzle, whatever. And you, at the end, you found out that you had this big hole on your page to fill out, and you have only a little piece of content to fill it out with, and you decided to blow up the size of that bar graph, right? We've all been there, we've all done that. It's not the right decision, right? The size of an object in a composition should be relatively proportional to the importance of that object in the composition, right? So that bar graph can be smaller. Not only that, why does the bar graph have a legend? That's a little bit absurd, right? We could simply transform the legend into the labels of the graphic down here. A general principle in visualization design, by the way, is if you can avoid legends and instead label things directly on your chart, do label things directly. Don't use a legend. Only use a legend when it's absolutely necessary. For example, imagine that instead of one bar graph, we had 5 bar graphs, all of them with the same 2 categories, blue, red, blue, red, blue, red. Well, in that case, it would be too repetitive to label them directly. It's much better to have a legend. But if we only have one bar graph with 2 bars, then we can just label them directly. And then why is it vertical, right? Why is the bar graph vertical? That is a little bit problematic, because I can see that there are error bars here, and they are barely visible because the graphic is very squat, it's very short. If we rotate the graphic, then we will be able to expand the graphic a little bit more. These are all recommendations. This is a process, if you remember on webinar 1, this is the process of deconstructing the graphic, putting yourself in the shoes of the designer and try to walk through the process of designing this poster, trying to assess whether a particular decision is sound or not, or whether you can find alternatives to that particular design decision. And now let's go back to one of the things that I said before, right? How text heavy it looks like. There are 2 reasons for that. One of them is that every section in this poster is contained inside a box. Boxes everywhere. My personal principle about using boxes or boxing things out in a composition is put a box around a piece of content if you want to visually isolate it from everything else, or you want to emphasize it for some reason. If you have that reason, then by all means put a box behind that piece of content. But if you put a box behind every single object in your composition, then that defeats the whole purpose of the boxes. We can safely remove all these boxes, or we could keep just a box around, let's say, the introduction, if that is the most important part of the poster, or the conclusion, if that is the most important part of the poster, depending on what we want to emphasize. Now, what about the text? Well, if we go back to the principle of design that I showed you before, things that are the same should look alike, things that are different should look different. If you focus your eyes on the first column, you will see that there's a sense of sameness there. It all looks the same, right? All the text, even the titles, even if the titles are bigger than body copy, they very much look the same in terms of color, right? And then if you go to the specific aim sections, you can see that there are different categories of text there, right? We have the title, we have subtitles, we have bullet points. Each one of those is a different thing. Things that are the same should look alike. Things that are different should look different. If we vary the style of those different elements in the textual elements a little bit more, not only by size, but also by style and by color, and then we add a little bit more of negative space in between negative space in visual design is also called white space, is essentially margins, bigger margins in between the text boxes or the text paragraphs that we have here. The graphic is going to become more readable. Well, let me show you what happens if we make all these changes. This is a possible alternative design. It's not a perfect design, right? It's just an alternative design to the original one. Doesn't it look like it contains that it has less content, less data than the previous one? It does, right? It looks lighter. It seems that I have removed a lot of elements, and I haven't. It's the exact same amount of content. It just looks easier on the eyes because I am applying these very, very basic principles that, again, if you internalize and start applying systematically to your own work, your designs are going to improve significantly. This is the main secret behind my classes, right? If you remember on webinar 1, I show you examples of a student work, right? These are graphics designed by my students who had no prior experience in visual design at the beginning of the semester. Simply by hammering to them the importance of these principles of visual hierarchy, consistency, variety, organization, and so on and so forth, in a couple of months, all of them listen to me repeating these principles on their work. When they show me their work, you need more consistency here, you need better hierarchy here, you need better design here, you need to line up things better here and there. Just by the process of applying these very basic principles, they all reach this point in which they create graphics that look much more professional than before. And as an effect of that, of the graphics looking much more better organized, they also look more beautiful. Now, that leads me to the last part of the presentation. Then we will have plenty of time for the Q&A. So most of the graphics that I design, most of the projects that I create myself as a visualization designer, as an art director, are graphics like the ones that you have just seen, right? The Brazil's graphics are explanatory, that try to be as clear as possible, right? It's straightforward, presenting the data in a clear and digestible way. But I'm also very interested, not so much perhaps as a designer, but more as a scholar and also as a reader, interested in the work of people who have a more creative angle to their work. That doesn't mean that I'm going to apply these to my own work, but it still interests me because it shows us that something that I hinted on webinar 1, visualization is not just one thing. And visualization is not always about presenting the data as clearly, cleanly, and as straightforwardly as possible. Sometimes we can present data more creative, more playful, more interesting manner, depending on what the purpose of the visualization is. So let me talk to you about my friend Jaime Serra. Jaime is a visualization designer who worked for many years for the news industry, for newspapers in Catalonia, in Argentina, and in many other countries. And he's an extraordinary visualization designer, someone who is perfectly capable of designing the types of graphics that I do myself every day, right? Line graphs, bar graphs, maps, etc. But he also has sort of like this more creative angle, right? He also has a side career as a visual artist. He has done exhibits all over the world throughout the years. There is an interview with him in my latest book, The Art of Insight, in which we discuss several of his most creative projects. I'm going to show you just my favorite one among them. So years ago, Jaime was writing an opinion column for one of the main newspapers in Catalonia, La Vanguardia. And in this column, this opinion column, was called a visual column because the column was not just written text. He also visualized things. And the column that he wrote was about coffee consumption. He decided that he wanted to see and visualize how much coffee he drinks throughout a year. Now, if I had to do that myself, I'm not a particularly creative person. The way that I will do it is that every day when I'm drinking coffee, right, I will try to always drink my morning coffee in the same mug, in the same cup. And maybe I could draw a scale on the cup so I can measure how many milliliters of coffee I'm drinking. In the morning, I will measure that. I will write that down in an Excel spreadsheet. And then at the end of the year, I will be able to design, for example, a time series line graph of my coffee drinking patterns. Maybe there's some seasonality in the data. Maybe I'm drinking more during the week, less during the weekends, and that could be a seasonal patterns. Maybe I'm drinking less during vacation and more during work months. I don't know. But that would be the straightforward way in which we could visualize the data, right? pretty straightforward. But that line graph will be as any other line graph that we see every single day. It will be no distinctive to any other graphic. It will look okay, readable, interesting, but not particularly unique. Not particularly unique. And Jaime wanted to do something unique. So instead of designing a traditional line graph, what he did was to visualize his coffee drinking patterns using coffee stains. He got 12 pieces of paper, each one of them corresponding to a month of the year. He folded those papers to essentially subdivide them into columns and rows, like pages of a calendar. And then he left coffee stains on the corresponding quadrant to each corresponding day whenever he drank a cup of coffee. And the result of that was a physical data visualization of coffee drinking patterns. Because this is not particularly useful analytically speaking, right? Although you can still see patterns, right? You can still see months in which he was drinking not that much coffee in January, lots of coffee in May, then a week of no coffee in June, and tons of coffee at the end of June. Then July, then August, no coffee. Probably he was on vacation. And then December, he was not drinking coffee at all. Maybe he was on vacation. Now, notice what I'm doing here, because for my latest book, The Art of Insight, in the conversation that I had with Jaime about his creative work, I asked him, this is not very analytically useful, obviously, but he replied to me when we were having this conversation about analytical graphics versus more creative graphics by saying, nobody cares about my data. This is not important. The data itself that is being represented here is not important. What is important is the connection that I'm establishing with the reader. Because by visualizing my data, I am prompting my reader to see themselves, to look for themselves in the data, posing questions to the data, making assumptions about the data. Oh, Jaime was on vacation, or comparing themselves to the data, saying, oh, he was drinking a lot of coffee in May. I was not drinking coffee at all. That's so interesting. Why are we so different, right? So the purpose here is not to represent the data clearly, is to create a more emotional connection, not to the data, not even to the data itself, but to the phenomena that is embodied or represented by the existence of this personal data that Jaime was generating and also visualizing. So it's more like a data experience rather than a data visualization, although it is a data visualization because obviously there is a grammar of graphics at work here, right? The density of the stains is proportional to the amount of coffee that he was drinking. Now, there are many people nowadays who are experimenting with the visualization forms, so I am going to just mention them to you very briefly. I am a big fan of my friend Giorgia Lupi. Giorgia is a famous Italian visualization designer. Her website is giorgialupi.com. She's very famous for creating physical objects and installations, using artistic forms and hand-drawn forms to represent data. I would encourage you to visit her website and get familiar with her work. Also, my friend and collaborator, Federica Fragapane, also from Italy, very famous for using organic natural shapes to represent data. So here, for example, this is violence patterns in Brazil. And instead of using a regular bar graph to represent the data, she's using these feathery light shapes that are very evocative for some reason, right? There's something emotional built into them. Now, very important though, by showing you these examples, I am not telling you every single graphic that you produce from this point on needs to be like this or like this or like that. No, 99% of the time, our graphics need to stick to the traditional graphic forms that we use every day. Bar graphs, line graphs, scatter plots, choropleth maps, and so on and so forth. That's what I do. But there may be occasions in which you may want to explore these, this type of graphic. For example, just for the sake of argument, let's suppose you're doing a very long story about coffee imports and exports all over the world. What do you put in the body of this story? Well, traditional charts, right? Maps showing the flows of goods and, of coffee from one country to the other, exporting whatever, bar graphs to compare coffee production and coffee consumption, line graphs to show patterns over time. So traditional charts. But what do you put in the opening of the story? What do you open the story with? Maybe with something that is a little bit more unique, a little bit more artistic, a little bit more visually attractive, something like this. So there's a place also, in my opinion, for these types of data visualizations. They don't only represent the data, they may also bring people into the data because they are so unique right? You'd never see anything like this, or like this, or like this. There's something useful in that. So they're also functional in their own way. So that is one of the trends that intrigue me the most these days, right? The use of these more creative types of data visualizations. Even if I don't employ them myself very, very often, I still see that I greatly believe that there's a place for them. But there are many other trends. For example, I'm very interested in the use of humor in data visualization. Years ago, I mentioned Nigel Holmes, a all-time visualization designer, to write a book about humor in data visualization. The title is Joyful Infographics, and I was honored and happy to edit this book, Joyful Infographics, a friendly human approach to data. And it's all about humor in data visualization, how we can introduce a slight, subtle, and elegant notes of humor to our graphics. Now, humor is not always appropriate, right? But when it is appropriate, when the topic of the graphic lends itself to introduce a note of humor, that can take us a long way, because making people smile when we present information to them creates an emotional connection. It makes the data look more interesting. It makes the data feel warmer for some reason. Now, I have tried to apply that to my work sometimes, introducing a little bit of humor. So years ago, throughout a collaboration that I have with Google, I was lucky enough to work with my friend Nadie Bremer. Nadie is a visualization designer based in the Netherlands, visualizing Google search data related to our pets. Right? What do people search for in Google when we search for why is my cat doing whatever? Why is my dog doing whatever, right? What comes after? What are the most common searches in Google? The project is titled Why Do Cats and Dogs? And Nadie, I didn't design this graphic myself. This is all by Nadie. I simply art directed the project. Nadie created this beautiful project in which you have, these cute animations of the cats and the dogs. Then it lets you choose between cats and dogs. I'm more a dog person. I have more cats and dogs than dogs. Sorry, more dogs than cats. So why do dogs? What is the most common search for dogs? You may be wondering, well, the most common search in dogs is why is my dog licking, right? That's the most common search. But what comes after licking? Well, licking me, licking my feet, licking people. Notice here that the size of the bubble is proportional to the volume of searches. Why is the dog licking people so much? Feet, me, those are the most common searches. And then another very common search for dogs is why is my dog eating? And what comes after eating? Grass and poop, right? Those are the most common types of searches. When people search for why is my dog eating grass, or why is my dog eating poop? I'm making you smile, right? Through the presentation of the data, these cute animations and the friendly looking imperfect shapes used to reproduce the data and so on and so forth, right? I'm presenting the data to you in a way that is friendly and full of humor, in order to make you smile. Again, this is not always appropriate, obviously, but when it is, it can take us a long way. Another trend, another thing that gets me interested these days, is ways of putting readers at the center of the visualization. The example that I usually put, and I should draw it at some point, because it's an example that I always present in talks like this one. Let's imagine that you do a histogram, right, of income distribution in a country, right? So the horizontal axis is the income brackets. I'm drawing the graphic with my hands. Income brackets on the horizontal axis, on the x-axis. And then the y-axis is the number of people or the number of families on each one of the income brackets. Well, a histogram of income or wealth distribution will be very skewed to the left, right? We will have many people on the lower end of income or the lower end of wealth, right? So the bars will be really high over here. And then the bars on the right-hand side, richer and richer and richer, those bars will be lower and lower and lower, representing a smaller size of the population that is extremely rich, right? So the distribution of income and the distribution of wealth in most countries is very skewed. It's a very skewed distribution. Now, that's interesting per se, because it's a picture of income inequality or wealth inequality. But if on top of that, on top of representing the wealth or the income or whatever it is, before we show the data, we ask the reader, what is your estimate of wealth? What is your estimated wealth? Or what is your estimated income? And we have the reader input that data in the graphic. And then we show the graphic and we add to the histogram a line that says, you are here. You are richer than 50% of the population. You're in the median. You're richer than 50% of the population and poorer than 50% of the population. So you're the perfect median. Or you are here. You're richer than 70% and poorer than 30%. By adding that element to the graphic, to the very same graphic, we are making the graphic more engaging to that particular reader. I call that the me layer in visualization. Where am I? How do I compare, right? Whenever we can introduce this element to graphics, that greatly increases interest. We have a lot of proof of that throughout the years because people tend to see themselves in the data. Now, let me show you an example of this application, of the application of this principle. So this is a graphic that I art directed years ago for a Brazilian publication called Agência Lupa, and it asks the question, how many people died of COVID-19 in Brazil, right? That's a question that has been answered and visualized many, many times through traditional visualizations. But the designers of this piece, my friends Vinicius Sueiro, Tiago, and many others, decided to visualize the data in a completely different way. They decided to ask the question or to pose the following idea. Let's suppose that we can make the data feel a little bit more physical and closer to the reader by posing the question, if every person in Brazil who died of COVID-19 had been your neighbor, how big the circle around you would be, right? How big the circle around you, if all of them were neighbors. The graphic is an interactive graphic. You can insert your address in Brazil over there, and it will make you the first victim of COVID-19. You are here. You are the first person who died of COVID-19 in Brazil. Let's imagine that. Then a week later, 46 people had died of COVID-19, and this is how big the circle will be around you. And they are not abstract people anymore to you. These are your neighbors, right? This is the person who you see every day going to get coffee, to buy bread in the corner store, whatever. These are people you see every day, and this is how big the circle around you in your neighborhood is, if all of the people who died of COVID-19 had been your neighbors. And then at the peak of the pandemic, when we reached more than 600,000 people dying of COVID-19, how big the circle is. This is Sao Paulo, Brazil, by the way. Take a look at how big the circle is. Now, very likely most of you are not very familiar with the physical and human geography of Sao Paulo, Brazil, but Sao Paulo is an extremely densely populated city. It's a huge city, but also extremely densely populated. If you live in Sao Paulo or you're familiar with Sao Paulo and you see this circle, that's shocking because it's a gigantic circle. It's so many people. And the circle is very different. For example, if you are someone who lives in the Amazon region of Brazil, your circle will encompass an entire state. It's a gigantic circle. It is shocking to see it. This is arguably one of my most popular projects ever in my entire. It's not mine. They designed it, but one of the projects that I art directed that became most popular. One of my most successful projects. It got picked up by the main news organizations in Brazil. It was shown on TV. People share it millions of times in social media, right? Showing their own map, because after you generate your map, you can save it and share it. So people share it thousands and tens of thousands of times. And you know what the most common reaction was to the map? To this map, it was, oh wow, I had never imagined that this number is actually so big. There is a phenomenon that has been studied by some psychologists called quantitative numbness. This is related to that old saying, one death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic, right? It's hard to feel big numbers. A million sounds the same as a billion, sounds the same as a trillion, sounds the same as a quadrillion. It's all a big number. It doesn't feel the same way. It doesn't feel at all. It's just a big number, right? We don't feel numbers. We become numb. At some point, after a particular threshold in terms of quantity, we become numb to those numbers. So it is useful in some cases, I would say, to try to find ways to visualize the data in a way that feels bigger, that actually we get a sense of how gigantic this catastrophe was in Brazil or in many other countries. After that, by the way, the application compares the number of people who died of COVID-19 in Brazil to the population of a town that is close to you, right? It detects the closer population to you. In this case, it is San Caetano do Sul, which is one of the satellite cities of São Paulo that has a population that is very close to 600,000 people. I'm getting to the end, okay? And then we'll have time for questions, just a couple of minutes more. I'm also interested in combining narrative and pedagogy. I'm interested in, for example, creating visualizations that not only tell a story about the data, but that I can also use to explain to people how to read those graphics. We recently put this at work with a series of stories that I created with a group of collaborators for the Communications Office of the European Union, titled Understanding the EU Through High-Value Datasets. This is a series of stories that visualize high-value datasets from the European Union. But each one of the stories, which is nice enough, but my favorite part of this project was a little article that is paired with each one of those stories that tells you something about data visualization or about data reasoning. So there's an introduction to data visualization paired with story one. There is an introduction about the dangers of confounding correlation and causation paired with story two. I'm very interested in this type of educational resource, showing people something fun and interesting and using that as a Trojan horse to teach them something that may sound a little bit too dry, right? Oh, statistics, this is so boring. Well, it is not boring. Statistics are essential and they can be a lot of fun. Let me show you how fun they can be through this story, using this story as the entry point for you to understand the data. And then finally, visualization, as I mentioned before, is just one type of data sensification, right? What I have been presenting to you these days is one way in which we can present data, but there are many other ways. There are people out there experimenting with data physicalization, creating sculptures based on data. This is fantastic, not only because it creates great data experiences, but also because they open the door for more data accessibility. People who are visually impaired may not be able to see your graphics, but they may be able to touch your visualizations and actually get a sense of the data. This is just another website that you can consult to see more examples. Or data sonifications, as I mentioned before, transforming data into music or into sounds, which I have already illustrated. Anyway, this is the end of the presentation today. Just a couple of more things in terms of housekeeping before we go to the Q&A. Remember that we have several extra resources for all these webinars. They are available through the Data Academy website, but also through my own Google Drive, right? There's a readings folder, which contain not only the extra readings, but also all the slide decks that I have been using these days. And the last slides of this particular slide deck contain more book recommendations, besides the one that I have already mentioned. There are books that are freely available out there that you can download for free and legally. For example, Fundamentals of Data Visualization by Klaus Wilkie. This is one of the best introductions to data visualization out there. And Klaus, the author, was kind enough to make the book fully accessible freely online, the draft of the book, through his website. So that if you Google Fundamentals of Data Visualization, you will find it. And R for Data Science. I already mentioned that I tend to use R, the R programming language, at a very basic level. R for Data Science, written by one of the authors of several libraries of R, Hadley Wickham, is one of the best introductions to the R programming language, and it also has several sections about data visualization. One thing, by the way, the fact that these books are fully available online don't mean that we should not try to support the author. So I would kindly ask you, if you read these books, if you use these books after I recommend them to you, try to also purchase a physical copy of them or an ebook of them to support the authors. I've already mentioned some of these books. Colin Ware's Information Visualization, Perception for Design. This is the 4th edition. The one that I have here is the 3rd edition, is the one that I showed yesterday in class. The Data Visualization Handbook by Juuso Koponen and Jonathan Hilden, originally published in Finnish, but then later translated to English, in my opinion, is one of the best introductions to data visualizations. It's a very comprehensive, very deep introduction to visualization and information design. And the Wall Street Journal Guide to Information Graphics is a practical cookbook-style book related to data visualization. Building Science Graphics by my friend Jen Christensen. She's the art director at Scientific American magazine, digs very deeply into the design of scientific posters or graphics that you can show in your own papers. And then yesterday I mentioned that I tend to use tools such as R and Adobe Illustrator and many others, but I'm aware that many of you probably use Excel for your daily work. Be aware that Excel can be an extremely powerful tool for data visualization if you know how to use it well. So the book titled Data Visualization in Excel by John Schwabish, who is a visualization designer and a data scientist and an economist, is a good introduction to creating better graphics with Excel. And also the websites by Stephanie Evergreen and John Peltier contain lots of advice on visualization with Excel. And with that, we get to the end. I would like to thank you all again for being here with me for an hour and a half. Wow, I hope that this was not very boring. It's a lot of content, I know, but I really want to go over all these content with you here today. Let me jump to the this screen to stop sharing, and let's see what questions we have. So let me go to the questions. Let's see. I'm going to go to the questions document. Oh, so many questions. How do you decide the order of the media in the x-axis? Oh, good question. This is related to the graphic of the survey, the market survey thing. I don't remember. That was a very quick makeover. So I think that I ordered them by average height of all the bars. I may be wrong with that, but if it were a real case scenario, then that would be the way in which I would organize it, from highest to lowest on average. Or maybe it is different, right? The order even of the groups of bars themselves may be different depending on maybe we want to emphasize, I don't know, social media. If we had that element and we want to put that first before the others, okay? So the decision was not completely arbitrary, but also I didn't think that much about it. Does AI to HTML serve the same purpose for accessibility? Well, AI to HTML is a tool to transform Adobe Illustrator graphics into graphics that you can publish on the web. So I don't know whether it has anything related to accessibility built in. Annotations are the author's way to impart meaning with context. Is the skill to make them brief answers or prompt curiosity in what the visualization is really about? Well, it's actually skill. It's certainly skill. And it also involves, I would say, some honesty on our, well, not some honesty, a lot of honesty in our part, right? We need to try to convey with those annotations our best understanding of what the data means. I also like to introduce, whenever there is some uncertainty to my understanding of the data, I try to build that into the writing. So we think that this is the best explanation for this peak or this low or whatever, this phenomena, but there are alternative explanations, right? And let me explain them in the graphic itself, or I may add a footnote or something like that. Do I have a checklist to analyze, plan a data visualization? Yeah, the 3 webinars is essentially that. So if you go back to the slide decks and the recordings, you will see that it's a very long 4.5 hour checklist of things that I pay attention to when we design a visualization. And then more specifically for different elements in a visualization, for example, accessibility, chartability, the resource that I mentioned, that's a checklist of things to look into. So it's a checklist within the checklist. It's a nested hierarchy of checklists, these webinars. What strikes me about the Brazilian telescope poster is the density of their content. In what scenarios more area might be beneficial for the placement of the different elements? That's up to you. I mean, I have been told in the past by friends of mine and colleagues of mine that my graphics tend to be quite dense in terms of content. I don't disagree with that, right? My graphics tend to be more dense than graphics designed, for example, by friends of mine who don't come from a background in journalism or data science, but come from a background in graphic design. They tend to design posters that are a little bit more, a little bit looser in terms of content, don't go that deeply into the data and information. That's perfectly acceptable. I understand what they are coming from. But my priorities when I design graphics is that if I can add a little bit of context or a little bit of an extra explanation to something, a little bit of an extra caveat, etc., I try to do it. I try not to go overboard with it. I still try to have, generous margins in between sections and so on and so forth. That's a question of style. And it also relates again to what I have been repeating All of this is subjective, right? But I can give you my reasons, which is I think that visualization is not about simplifying things. It's about clarifying things. So if I think that if a piece of content is absolutely necessary for a reader to understand what is going on, I will include it, even if that makes the graphic look a little bit busier than before, because I tend to prioritize that clarity and that depth and that explanation over the visual appearance of the graphic. But every designer is different. Every designer is different. Let's see what else we have here. The icon libraries. Unfortunately, no, I don't have any recommendations about that. What about the country order in figure 6? It seems random. That refers to the graphic about fishers, I believe. I don't remember how the countries were organized. That's a little bit besides the point. But that leads me to repeat something that I mentioned already. You know, every decision should not be arbitrary. There should be a reason. So if the countries were sorted in that particular way, the reasons why they were sorted that way should be explicit, right? Maybe they are sorted alphabetically. I don't know. Maybe they are sorted from highest to lowest. Maybe they are sorted according to one of the segments of the bar graphs presented, right? So there could be good reasons for all of them. When someone shares the story behind a data set, what are the key things I should focus on to understand it well and translate it into an effective visualization? This is such a long question because every data set is different. Every data set has its own peculiarities. What I would re-emphasize or repeat is what I said when I was briefly talking about narratives. It's like, don't miss the forest from the trees and don't miss the trees for the forest. Both of them are important. Try to think about the interplay or the balance between the big picture and the specifics. Try to find a structural representation that suits the nature of your understanding of the data well, right? If your understanding the data can be is linear, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, present it linearly. But if it is not linear, right? If there are alternative explanations, caveats, uncertainties, your understanding of the data should match that understanding. Your presentation of the data should match that as much as possible. It looks nicer to you, but not necessarily for everyone. Moreover, what meaning is color conveying besides niceness? Yeah, I mean, sure, we all have our tastes, we all have our preferences, etc. I completely agree. Again, this is all subjective, right? But at the same time, I have found that there are certain principles of design that tend to be more universal than others. So, for example, what I mentioned when talking about graphic design, these principles of hierarchy, consistency, and variety, if I apply the way that I have described, they tend to create graphics that look more pleasant to the eyes of most people, or more people than not, right? If you create a graphic in which there is no visual hierarchy, there is no consistency, that is going to look bad to many people, to more people than not, right? So this is all about the numbers of people who find something in general or on average more pleasant or less pleasant to the eye. So it is still subjective, but it is not fully subjective. There's some objectivity to that, I would say. Interactive visualization. So I didn't have time to focus on. There's a question there that says, does the same logic for message convey applies to static and interactive graphics? I would say, and what recommendations I have about interactive visualizations? I would say that almost all the advice that I have been giving in these webinars apply regardless of whether your graphic is interactive or static. Principles of presentations, principles of consistency, principles of depth, structure, narrative, and so on and so forth, all applies to static and interactive visualizations. But when we create interactive visualizations, we also need to think about buttons and menus and search boxes and so on and so forth. And that's another class. That's another webinar. What I can leave you with, though, is the fact that interactivity in visualization is like any other feature in visualization, right? More color. Why should I use more color in visualization? Or when do I add more color to a visualization? Well, I add more color when I think that adding more color would be beneficial to the reader, right? Will be beneficial to understanding the story. Interactivity is the same. If I think that adding a search box, or adding a menu, or adding hover over effects or whatever adds to the visualization, adds to the understanding of the depth, then I add it. But if I can present something linearly and with no interaction, and I can get away with it and present the story in a way that I think that is truthful and deep and understandable enough, then I don't add interactivity at all. I don't add interactivity for the sake of adding interactivity. There is a question in the chat window asking whether we could share the content in the chat window. I'm going to share the link to the slides and the extra readings right now. Is the link not to the Data Academy, but to my personal Google Drive, which is exactly the same. You can download everything from there. The 3 slide decks and the extra readings are in that folder. And I have a hard stop very soon because I have a meeting coming up. Actually, with Nadim Bremer, one of the designers I mentioned before, the Why Do Cats and Dogs designer. We are working on another project together. It's always a delight to work with people like Nadi. Book recommendations about typography. Yes, 2 of them. The Elements of Typographic Style, I think that is titled, The Elements of Typographic, let me type it, and yeah, The Elements of Typographic Style. I'm going to actually put the titles in the chat window. That's a very deep introduction to the principles of typography. And then for something oh, it says that the link is not, the Google link doesn't work. Oh, okay. Let me try to share it again. The Elements of Typographic Style, and then Thinking with Type by Ellen Lupton. Thinking with Type. Those are 2 wonderful books about typography. Imma, can you please share the link to the materials in the chat window? The links to the materials of everything, so people can have access to them?
Right now.
Okay, thank you. And let me see, I have time for another couple of questions, I think. So let me go to the questions document again. My opinion about our AR or VR, right? Say augmented reality and virtual reality. I'm not an expert on any of that. I have a friend, a colleague here, Kim Greenfeather, who specializes in visualization with VR, and he has created very interesting immersive projects with augmented reality. I am a little bit on the fence. I think that they are useful in some contexts. So, for example, to navigate physical objects or physical spaces in a virtual environment. I have seen, for example, recreations of the human heart, high resolution, database based recreations of a human heart, and you can sort of like wear the augmented reality glasses and walk inside the heart and see the internal anatomy of the heart from the inside. That's an incredible application of that type of technology. Now, in terms of data visualization, the representation of abstract data in the way that we have done here today, I'm a little bit on the fence. I don't know whether how useful these technologies can be, but I'm very open-minded. I mean, I may be mind blown by examples that I may encounter in the future. There's a question. I find the consistency, variety, and hierarchy rule useful. Do you have resources to get more into these? Yes. There is a great introduction to visual design, a title, White Space. I'm going to actually put the title. White Space is Not Your Enemy. That's a funny title, right? For a book about design. So it's White Space is Not Your Enemy, a beginner's guide to communication visually through graphic, web, and multimedia design. So this is a book that deals with those basic principles of graphic design. White space is not your enemy. There is also one titled The Non-Designer's Design Book, which I also find a little bit too basic, perhaps, but it's still very nice as an introduction to visual design. So those are the 2 book recommendations that I will have for you. And then let me get another one. When you work on a project, when do you consider it complete? That's such a great question. When I meet the deadline, that's essentially it. I usually work on projects, including this slide deck. I have been tweaking this class and the slides for it until the very last minute, very, very last minute. And I keep updating it all the time. I updated this last one yesterday, actually, with a couple of more examples. So when the deadline is missed, and also, jokes aside, when I feel that it presents the information in a way that I would enjoy reading as a reader, or in a way that I deem that is correct, right? According to everything that I know about the data, everything that I have discussed with my collaborators, and everything that I know, or that I think I know about visualization design. Anyway, everyone, this is I think that this is going to be the end. I still have a few minutes before my next meeting. Thank you so much again. Oh, I see that Jesus Nieto is in the chat. Hi, Jesus. Thank you again, everyone, for being here. Again, I hope that it was not overwhelming. Again, this is just your introduction. I hope that this has whetted your appetite to learn more. Please keep reading, build your own library of books if you want to dig deeper into visualization. It's really a fun world. Even if you don't end up being a professional visualization designer, this is a skill that is worth having. It's like writing. If you know how to write well, you're going to become a better communicator, but also a better thinker, a better reasoner. Visualization works the same way. It opens the door to better communication, but also to better reasoning. And anybody and everybody, as I hope that I have been able to prove to you these days, can become a great designer. So go ahead and do it. Become great designers. Thank you so much.